Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Karina. It's time for a little English tonight, and I'll try and give you some, well, last-minute study advice for your A-levels. Okay. As I said, I will try and give you some input on how you can study most effectively on my, like on the sheet that I prepared for you. The last is in brackets because I'm not really 100% sure where there is a difference between study tips in general and last-minute study tips. Generally, I would say that I would not leave studying for languages or German at that until the very last time, because there's only a few things that you can do, I think. So you might want to start early enough. I found it hard to find stuff that you can really do last minute and that would be effective if you did it last minute only. Let me start with a quick word of advice, or with a little word of caution. There are a lot of people who study vocabulary on a last-minute basis, which probably does work for vocab tests because our brains are sort of able to retrieve relevant information on, like, if there's only a little time in between. In vocab tests, you usually have either the German word given or the English word given, and you're only filling gaps, kind of. Sorry, you're only filling gaps, kind of. Our brain can do that, and it can do that very last minute. As I said, is probably the success of most people in school. Studying for vocab tests the night before might prove effective. I guess it depends on the type of learner you are. Might not work for some people, but for some it definitely does. But to cut a long story a little shorter, stuff that you, or vocabulary that you learn on short notice, you'd be able to reproduce that in a vocab test, but you may not be able to include it in your active vocabulary, into your workshots that you actually use during the exam. Especially not for the dialogue, because in the dialogue you need to be spontaneous, and vocab that we only learned like the night before the exam, it doesn't enter your active vocabulary, so you won't be able to use it spontaneously. Might be a different story with the monologue that you can prepare, because well, you might be able to like remember the words that you learned and kind of like, well, yeah, that was a good vocab, or that was a good word that I wanted to use, that was good vocabulary that I wanted to use. In the monologue, in the preparation time, you might be fine because it's kind of a vocab test. Like, you know, situation is the same. You have the word in German, and the only thing you have to do is to kind of conjure up basically the English word. In the dialogue, as I said, in a spontaneous situation, this might be comparatively harder. So it's up to you to decide whether or not it's worth the effort studying vocab like really close before the exam. I would strongly advise you to do it early enough, and to also, if possible, revise it. But then you guys probably have vocab tests anyway, so you had the chance to study the vocab once, and then it's only kind of refreshing memory kind of thing. As I said, if you are the type of person to study last minute, we have to decide whether or not it's worth the time. One thing that I always or usually point out to my students is that I would advise them to review and reread content and also vocabulary to some extent regularly. Did I already say that? Well, anyway, it doesn't really, or at least with me that works, it doesn't need to look like studying necessarily. Nobody says that you have to sit down on your table and study like properly, But there's a lot of things that you can do. You can reread the text you did in class, the text out of your textbook, or the handouts that you were given. You can also do some internet research and read newspaper articles. I don't know, in bed, on the sofa, I don't know. It doesn't have to be a very long amount of time. You don't have to spend your whole Saturday or Sunday evening rereading stuff, but you could make it a ritual, I don't know, Sunday evening before you start the week again on Monday. 10-15 minutes saves you a lot of time in terms of content as well. Browsing the internet for the topics that you have to know for the exams also saves you some time, because you know where to look for additional information if you are a last-minute studier and have to look for additional information on quite short notice, a couple of days before the exam. You should, of course, review the most important class content as well, but do so selectively. I guess there are chapters that are easier to tackle than others. If you have a massive text about how to eat healthy, for example, in your textbook, this might not be that important, because you can do that with common sense. You can do that with your knowledge of the real world, sort of. I would select topics that are harder, I don't know, racism topic, migration, world of work, where you have all those special terms like affirmative action and the glass ceiling and so on and so forth. So there are probably chapters that you can sort of skip content-wise or only touch upon more briefly. So make sure you select wisely, because starting with the first chapter and going in a chronological order might not be the best thing to do if you study on very short notice. So make a list of contents according to difficulty. Start with the most difficult one and go down, and well, do a ticking off bucket list kind of thing. Same goes for the vocabulary, I suppose, because there's such just words that we use all the time and that we are more familiar with. Set the priorities list. There we go. I don't know if the priorities list works, actually. I have never used the priorities list in my studying, to be honest. But as I said, I would definitely make a list of chapters that you find more difficult, or about sub-chapters that you want to do some research on. For example, in, I don't know, the tourism topic, for example. Tourism as such is quite easy. So are the different types of tourism, the different types of holidays. You know what you can do. You can go to spas, you can do sports, you can do whatever. So we know that you can go on cruise trips. But if you find topics like disaster tourism or dark tourism a bit harder, or if you say, well, I don't know much about that, but I know a lot about tourism, so put dark tourism, disaster tourism on your priorities list and skip the tourism thing, because you have a text anyway, and if the text is well chosen, then it should give you a lot of information anyway. So focus on the hard subtopics that there are. Some people have very nice and tidy and beautiful notes of what of what your trainers say during lessons, but then they don't use an awful lot of colors. For those of you who like to learn on short notice, only very briefly before the exam, you may want to revise your notes and start to highlight stuff, highlight most important information or information that would otherwise have found entrance into your priorities list. So stuff that you're not 100% sure about. You may want to highlight this information. Our brains, well, they basically remember it more easily. They remember it better. There's scientific backup for that. I guess that if you only have a blank page and you're handwriting in, I don't know, blue ink, then there's not much change for the brain, and the brain would always remember stuff easier that is in some sort of color. Or what you could also do is make a summary of your notes. It's not on the sheet here. Don't know why actually. A while ago I did a stream on like learner types and learning strategies and stuff like that. There is definitely a lot of people, and I know what I'm talking about, who find it easiest to remember stuff if they wrote it down themselves. Not on a computer, but handwritten notes, they obviously work the best. So you could use your notes and produce like a mini summary of the most important aspects of your notes and maybe the highlighted stuff or the things that you highlighted earlier. Make a study plan is kind of the same thing as the priorities list. If you only learn like 2 days or 2 nights before the exam, you should focus on your weak spots only. The advantage that there is probably that in regular classes people do quite a lot of revision by the fact that there are usually like grammar reviews and that there are chapter reviews and that there are tests like Schularbeiten to write. So first of all, you should actually know what your weak spots are, like the stuff that you missed in class, the stuff where you were not 100% like attentive kind of thing. So by the studying that you did during the course or by the reading that you did during the course, you should be able to judge what your weak spots are. You know that. You will also get a list of topics handed out, distributed by your trainers. You probably recognize the topics that you're not that good at. So I suppose creating a study plan with the weak spots is quite easy, and then obviously work on them. Tying up with what I said about learner types, there's different types of learners. People who find visuals very helpful, that would be the notes and the highlighting. Handwritten notes and highlighted text or highlighted paragraphs or passages of text or single sentences help visual learners a lot. They normally know, first of all, where on the page the relevant information was, and this then helps them make the connection to the content, and then they're able to reproduce that. By the time you do your A-levels, you should know what type of learner you are, or you should have figured that out by the time you have been in school or in lessons for a while. So that should not be that hard. So visual learners are those who need handwriting and highlights and so on and so forth. There's people who like audios the most, which is probably, well, quite hard depending on like the content that you want to study. Nowadays that we live in a time where there is YouTube videos and YouTube tutorials for pretty much everything that you want. You might actually be lucky and find something. There might be a nice, short and concise YouTube video out there on the topic of your choice. People who are auditive types, they learn stuff the easiest when they listen to stuff. So as I said, YouTube tutorials lend themselves perfectly. Back in the days, people still produced like cassettes and video recordings and stuff themselves, or at least some of my friends did. I'm pretty sure that we don't do that much anymore. But anyway, you could check out the internet and see if it gives you any like good and reliable source that you can listen to on a last-minute basis. Because, well, yeah, if you're the auditive type of person and if you listen to a YouTube tutorial, you'd probably be able to retrieve the information a couple of days later for the exams. Flashcards, that's what we know as the Moderationskärtchen, the ones that you probably get for the exams as well. Flashcards are basically a summary. you write down the most important information on the flashcards in keywords. That's what I wanted to say. And then you can kind of go back and forth between the flashcards, maybe put the ones aside that you know the content of already, and have the ones that you don't memorize, have them go back into the pile, basically. Discard the ones that you already know. Probably also has a psychological effect, as you see the amount of stuff getting smaller, like the pile with the flashcards that you don't know anything of will gradually become smaller. So you will probably find out, well, it's very short before the exam, but I still know stuff. Well, distractions. We all know that we should study, and we can't because there's social media around. There is all types of, there's WhatsApp around, whatever. If you study, if you're really late with your studies, you probably want to make sure that there is no distractions, that you don't necessarily study next to the internet, because there's the danger of Facebook and others. You could do your research, so the stuff that you need the internet for, a little earlier, and then actually study and learn without the internet, only using your textbook and your notes. Maybe also putting aside your mobile phone. There's always some annoying group and so on and so forth that distracts you from the task. Well, whether or not you like to study with music depends on the type as well, so that's not necessarily a distraction. But as I said, if you only have a couple of days or a couple of nights left, make sure you devote all the time that you have to proper studying, instead of doing it only half-heartedly and checking all kinds of social media in between. Distracts the brain too much, and well, it's basically the very little amount of time that you had is wasted. Do research early enough, as I said. That's not a last-minute study type. That's a piece of advice, a very general one. Do your background research early enough. That's not studying, really. You can do it in front of your computers and kind of compile a list of, or a bunch of information that is relevant to your topics. It's not really studying yet. I would start that early enough if I was you, so that a couple of nights before or days before your exams, you can actually focus on studying. So start doing your research. There's a lot of online material out there. Revise the text in your book, and so on and so forth. Mixed study environments, that's also more of a psychological thing at the end of the day. If it is nice weather, which it won't be might be, but if you have your A-levels in winter, this might not be the most smart thing to do. But if it's a nice summer day, alternate between your bedroom, the sofa, and maybe outside in the sun. Our brains kind of respond to that. I don't know how, but they kind of refresh as soon as you change your location, and you'll find studying a lot easier. Or so experts say. Most of the study tips are not mine. So make sure that you have some change in where you are and in what you're doing as well. You might do some of the more difficult topics with flashcards. You might do the easier ones by only reading it, really, because that's all you need for a refreshment of your memory. So just make sure that your brain has some kind of change. That is something that really helps. I only ever tried it out when I had to learn poems by heart, but I always found that it helps a lot. Reading out stuff aloud is very good. The best thing is a combination of writing and then reading out loud, because then you hear it. You're kind of cheating your brain into believing that this was auditive input as well, and visual input as you wrote it and read it. If you read it out loud, people say that you remember stuff more easily, as I said, because your brain thinks that it just got some auditive input. Sounds like a terribly smart thing to do, really. Well, that is a tip that might not work for everyone, really. There are probably people who don't like to study with other people or think that they can't do it, that they're more productive by themselves. But sometimes, as a last-minute study advice, finding a peer, so a classmate, somebody who's in the same situation than you are, might help, because two brains normally are smarter than one. And you might be able to exchange some ideas, like some points that you may, or the person you study with might be able to give you some aspects, some input that you may not have thought of, and vice versa, of course. And by talking about it, because you would talk about it, discuss it, and maybe also write it down, you remember it. So finding a peer might be a quite intelligent thing to do if you're under time pressure. Think that was it, really. As I said, not all of them are last-minute study tips. Might be my fault, because, well, studying for me always looks the same. There's not much of a difference between last minute and like regular studying. I don't know. Let's have a quick recap of what I just said. Well, think about the vocab issue. Is it worth it? It hardly ever goes into your active workchats, unless you're really good at learning vocab, and unless you're one of those auditive types of people who watch a lot of TV series and stuff in English, because then your brain might make the connection if you have heard the word more frequently, and that might work. But if not, you have to decide whether or not it's worth investing time into vocab. Start early enough. The preparation work does not need to feel like studying. You spend some time in front of the computer every day anyway. And well, you might just browse the internet a little bit and try and find some relevant information on the topics. It helps, and on the internet there's a lot of interesting stuff out there as well. You might actually get properly interested into a topic, and reading online newspapers and stuff helps anyway. Review class content, but do so selectively. Set the priorities list. I think that is a good point. Make a list. Try to define the weak spots that you have, and tick them off as soon as you worked on them. Check out all the stuff that you think you know, or that it can kind of be done by common sense. And stick to the priorities list as well, of course. Find a way to study last minute or not. You have flashcards, you have mind maps, you have highlighters, you have summaries, you have all those like tools, if you want to call it that, at your disposal. Find something that works for you. Maybe not 2 nights before the exam. I hope that you have had some studying experience by the time, and know what type of learner you are. Would be a good start. Use the techniques that you feel most comfortable with. Use the techniques that you know will work for you. Go away from all the distractions that there are. Switch off your phone. Sit outside in the garden if you can, if weather permits. Move from your bedroom to somewhere else if it's quiet, or no. Just make sure you have a change of scenery a little bit. Read it out aloud. The more frequently I read it, the more convinced I am about this study tip. Might help. And find a peer. Maybe someone who is under the same time pressure than you are, because then I could imagine that the work is kind of very productive if you're both stressed out, sort of. Well, if you have any suggestions, let us know. If there are any study tips that you have that I did not consider, there might be some really fancy learning strategies out there that I never tried out and therefore don't know of. And yeah, I think that was it. And a general piece of advice, that's what I thought when I prepared for the stream. Don't leave it to the very last minute, I guess. Learning languages on a very, very, very last note is quite hard. You can always learn contents last minute, but I think the language aspect as such is very hard, and language output is what you will eventually be tested on. So I would advise you to start early enough. And yeah, with that, I'm going to leave you. If there is no suggestions or questions or anything else, should there be any, let us know. I'm always happy to share my great insights into studying with you. Thank you very much and good night.